afternoon. 17 years and 3 months ago, September 1993, 18 of us from CII landed up in Singapore and met the then Prime Minister, Mr. Goh Chok Tong, the then Trade and Industry Minister, Mr. Dhanabalan, who is now Chairman of Temasek. And we kept going back every year, more than once a year, in building a relationship with Singapore, because we felt that it was a critical relationship for India. In 1994, 1 year later, Mr. Narasimha Rao went, gave the Singapore lecture, and formally announced the Look East policy of India. So that's a quick history of our relationship. And Mr. George Yeo has been a central figure in that bilateral relationship between Singapore and India. So when we heard that he was visiting Calcutta, going to Shantiniketan yesterday, which he has done, we thought we'd ask him to spend some time with us, speak to us, whatever. He can speak about the world, Asia, ASEAN, India, whatever. And I'm delighted that we have the Singapore High Commissioner here, Mr. Calvin Yu, who has been very kind. He's taken off his tie because he saw I'm not wearing a tie. And with that, I'm also pleased to formally introduce to this audience Mr. Sanjeev Goenka, who goes back with me longer than Singapore. So he's a new member of our Board of Trustees of Aspen. He's a past president of CII and played a very significant role in our relationship with Singapore, as you will hear. Sanjeev, over to you.
His Excellency Mr. George Yeo, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Singapore, my Guru, Mr. Tarun Das, friends. This is a special occasion for me personally. I have recently joined the Board of Trustees of the Aspen Institute India, and this is my first event in that capacity. It's a special privilege that the keynote speaker and guest of honor today is Mr. George Yeo, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Singapore. This takes me back to 1995 and the CII centenary in Calcutta, when the then Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Goh Chok Tong, was the guest of honor and spent 3 days here with us. I had the unique distinction of welcoming the Prime Minister in my capacity as Chairman of CII Eastern Region. Truly great memories. Since that time, Singapore and India have come extremely close, in large part due to the vision of Mr. George Yeo, who has worked very hard to integrate India with Southeast Asia and ASEAN. He is the one person who has traveled extensively in India, including rural and backward areas of the country. He is also providing leadership together with Professor Amartya Sen to the revival of the Nalanda International University in Bihar. So, we have a very special world figure as our speaker today. We are going to listen to a man of integrity, of knowledge, and of great understanding. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. George Yeo, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Singapore.
Thank you, Tarun. Thank you, Sanjeev. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, I feel so honored to be here this afternoon to address members of the Aspen Institute in Kolkata. I'm here for the Tagore Conference, celebrating his 150th birth anniversary. Just this morning, I gave a speech about realizing Tagore's dream of good relations between India and China. And yesterday we were brought to see Shantiniketan, which I've always wanted to visit. The journey was a little long, and it was somewhat run down, the place. I was happy to visit, to be on that pilgrimage, because in many ways, Shantiniketan represents an ideal which, when it was first mooted, was perhaps ahead of its times, but which I believe becomes ever more relevant today. In particular, the China Bhavan. The China Bhavan, which was established by Tagore through a Chinese scholar, Tang Yinshan, who was in Singapore at that time. And Tagore met him in Singapore and brought him here. Chiang Kai-shek visited it in 1942, Zhou Enlai in 1957. But after the 1962 war, it became almost a ruin, with a collection of books no longer understood by the keepers of the place. But I believe one day, and it will not be in the too distant future, all that will be revived, and that icon of relations between China and India will become something of the future. And indeed something very important to all of us, not just to Indians and Chinese, but also to Singaporeans and other Asians, and indeed to everyone else in the world. The main point I made this morning is the re-encounter of China and India in this century will be of the highest importance. It will settle the main issue of war and peace, of prosperity and conflict, of progress or regression in the coming decades. China and India are both re-emerging, almost with a vengeance on the global stage. Just a matter of time before they again become the first and second biggest economies in the world, just through sheer size of population. And in every field, you are going to find Chinese and Indians playing increasingly important roles. So how China and India interact with each other will affect global politics, global economics, global culture. So it's a very interesting new chapter that we are seeing before us. We are not just observers, we are players, we are stakeholders in that process. And I think you, in your own position, can contribute either positively or negatively to what will unfold. That was the main point I wanted to make this morning. And I thought it had a resonance in the audience because this comes in the wake of recent comments about the rivalry between China and India, Premier Wen's visit, which was a good visit, but reservations expressed in the media. But I believe neither side wants relations to go bad because there's too much involved. And if we look at the larger sweep of things between China and India over the centuries, there's been no conflict. The 1962 war was the aberration, a war which left a deep scar here in India, but which on the Chinese side, as Ashish Chakrabarti mentioned in yesterday's Sunday Telegraph article, a war which the Chinese have virtually forgotten and remember at most as a border skirmish. Yes, it's got to be overcome by both sides. I believe it will be because the interests are much bigger and there's so much more benefit to be gained from cooperation. Last year I was in Tibet. I took the new remarkable train from Gormut to Lhasa, most of it above 4,000 meters on permafrost. And from there I traveled by road to Shikatse, and I was told on the way there that that railroad will be extended to Shikatse, which means that it comes quite close to the Natula Pass. And a Chinese official accompanying me said, you know, I hope one day we will link up to the Indian rail. Then Kolkata is only a few hundred kilometers away. If you think about it, that whole southwestern part of China is growing rapidly, remarkably. I mean, Tibet in the last 10 years has had 10% growth every year. But that has a small population. I mean, there's Sichuan and there are all the other provinces, all seeking outlets to the sea, but having now to depend on roads and railroads to the eastern seaboard, and from there around Southeast Asia to the Bay of Bengal. It is a direct link. I mean, the possibilities are limited only by our imagination. And when that happens, I believe Kolkata, the whole region around here, will boom. I mean, imagine the toing and froing, the contact, the cooperation, the sheer flow of people, of material, of services. So this is possible. It is not easy because there's always politics along the way. There are fears, there are suspicions, all of which have got to be managed, overcome, step by step. But it is an exciting new world that we're seeing before us. Before '89, it was a bipolar world. Berlin Wall collapsed, end of the Cold War. For a while, the US as a single hyperpower. Then now, rise of China, of India, of Brazil, of others. And from a bipolar world to a unipolar world to a multipolar world. And one in which, on any issue, different alignments become emergent in response to interests, but also a world in which the idea of the nation state matters less and less to individuals, to companies, and to tribes, because all of us have gone transnational. The families have gone transnational. Between Singapore and India, it's almost as if Singapore is an extension of India. I was with Chidambaram just a few months ago, and he was talking about India's internationalization. I said, yeah, like Singapore. Then he said, no, Singapore I consider to be a part of India. He said so not in a patronizing way, he said so in the most natural way. Because when he comes to Singapore, he feels at home, just as in many ways Singaporeans who come to India feel at home. And with Bengal, it is a special relationship going back to the East India Company, when from 1819 to 1867, we reported to Kolkata. So we were a daughter city. And this morning when I reflected on the role Bengalis play in the Nalanda project, so I said, well, in some ways I consider myself, with all other Singaporeans, as honorary Bengalis. Because it was from Bengal that we became what we are today, and through which we receive the laws, the administrative systems, the standards from the Raj. And it is a relationship which is not just a recent one, but it goes back. I mean, this is the place of the Buddha, the place of Nalanda, the place which always had links to Singapore, whether it was Tagore, whether it was Netaji, whether it is the present effort to revive Nalanda. And I believe, looking ahead, the old links, which are organic, will become important again. I just say all this by way of backdrop because I don't really know what your interests are, and I prefer to respond to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister, for that. You know, one of the points you made in your remarks said there will be an impact of China and India on global politics, global economics. Then you said global culture. What did you mean by global culture? How do you see China and India impacting on global culture?
I think for a long time, because of the Western domination, the way to the future was the Western way. And that was the received wisdom, almost axiomatic. So if you're a developing country, you say, okay, you measure yourselves against Western institutional practices, and you say, the closer I am, the higher the marks I get. And in some ways, Westerners saw us in those terms. So they would come up with indices and say, okay, this is how you rank. Against these indices, according to standards which are mostly Western standards. And I thought it reached a kind of a rather surreal position recently when the Nobel Peace Prize went to this Chinese dissident, Liu Xiaobo. And I had a chance to be listening to the BBC, listening to the president of the Nobel Committee, former Prime Minister of Norway, telling China that it should do this, it should do that, then China would have progress. But without doing this and doing that, then China would eventually be in trouble. I had mixed feelings, because on the one hand, he obviously meant well. I mean, his intentions, I had no doubts, were virtuous. But if you disagreed with him, you thought, how could he be so patronizing? How are you in that position to judge a country with such a huge population, with such a long history? So we are now at a stage where people no longer look to the West as the only model of development. There's also China, but I think China's model is only possible for Confucianist societies. I don't think it can work for non-Confucianist societies. And in India, while superficially it is a Western democracy, that's only a thin layer of many layers, going kilometers deep. So when Western countries say, oh, well, India is a Western democracy, I say, yes, it is a Western democracy, but it's much more than a Western democracy. And on many issues, what will dominate will not just be that top layer, but all the layers that are beneath. Which means now that if you're a developing country in Asia or Africa or Latin America, you say, well, there are many roads to the future. It's not clear which will work for whom. I've got to make my own judgment as to what is most suitable for me. And it's not only the Western road which will get me there. And in fact, if I were to follow blindly the Western road, I may not get there. So that's what I mean by a cultural change. It's not just an economic change or political change. It's a change of how we see human society to be best organized. It involves values, it involves institutional practices, it involves assumptions about how human communities should cohere on the basis of nations or tribes or corporations or extended families or whatever.
Sanjeev, you have a question?
Yes, I have actually a couple. Minister, you talked of a multipolar world, but what are the chances of our seeing a G2 world dominated by China and USA? Second, you talked of Southwest China and Calcutta, a link which can actually be very, very important. But this can happen if the trust deficit is removed. How can that happen?
No, trust takes time to be built up. In the end, countries act on the basis of interest. And you look at the numbers, you look at the accounts, and the trade is growing, and there's toing and froing, and there's students coming to each other. And we find more intermarriages. And in Singapore, we find more intermarriages. Singapore being, as Wang Gungwu once said, where the two mandalas intersect, the Chinese and the Indian. So I would say it will take time. Can it be a G2 world? Well, on some issues, if there's an agreement between the Chinese and the Americans, then it's harder for others to say, well, we take a different position. But between China and India, between China and the US, which is perhaps the single most important relationship in the world, there are many issues on which they cannot agree fully. And each knows that neither side wants it to be seen as a G2 world. They know that each is important to the other, but neither side wants it to be a G2 world because they know that on any issue they need others to come along. The US needed China to be part of the solution to the financial crisis, but they couldn't just expand the G7 or G8 to G9 because that would look very bad. So they make it G20, which was the next quantum level, which was stable. And that's what we have today. And the mechanics are more stable. I mean, others will try to make use of India, of course, but India is too big to be made use of anybody. I mean, India will be India, as Brazil will be Brazil, as Russia will be Russia, and each will act according to its own interest. So even though G2 is important, G2 will not dominate because the rest of the world will not allow the G2 to dominate. And it's not in the interest of either of the G2 countries to want it to be a G2 arrangement. But between China and India, especially the links between Kolkata and Tibet, I think the economic logic is irresistible. So a few years ago, the Natula Pass was reopened. It's still controlled more on the Indian side than on the Chinese side. But I believe little by little, it makes sense. You take Kailash. Kailash is a place for Indian pilgrimage. But it's a pilgrimage which is impeded on the Indian side but facilitated on the Chinese side. So if you fly to Kathmandu, from there it is all organized to Kailash. If you travel to the border, the moment you cross the Chinese side, there are roads, there are inns, there are restaurants, everything is organized. But the Indian side makes it difficult. Should it make sense? I mean, to me, that seems very curious. I only came to know of this when I was in Tibet and I heard about it. So I reflected. Shiva's abode, so important to India, why not make it easier? The Chinese will make some money from it. The Indians will be much happier. And the gods will be pleased. So of course, politicians, foreign ministers, prime ministers must all be the agents through which history unfolds itself, but I believe it will eventually be done. I'm not pessimistic. I mean, I'm realistic, but I'm not pessimistic. And once there's trade, and once borders become porous, settling border questions become much easier. The Soviet Union and China fought bitterly over islands in the river separating them. I think about 3 years, 4 years ago, they settled the entire border. There's no longer a border dispute between China and Russia. And there's absolutely no reason why between China and India the border question can also be resolved.
I'm personally involved in trying to bring China and India together through track 2 mechanisms and so forth. I think there's a huge disconnect between them and us and them. We don't understand each other. We don't communicate well with each other. And you talked about trade, Minister. We have great trade with them now. It was $1 billion bilateral trade 12 years ago. It's $60 billion now.
But about 100 billion. And
heading for 100 billion. But by the time we reach 100 billion, it will be 90 billion we'll be importing and only 10 billion we'll be exporting, And this is going to be a problem of sustaining that. And there's already a reaction to that happening. And we are finding for the industries where we are strong, there are all kinds of standards, procedures, and all of that which are opaque to us. And we are not able to enter the Chinese market. So how do you all find, at one time we said, let's turn to Singapore Chinese businessmen who are doing a lot of business in China, who understand China, to help us to connect. How do you find the Chinese market? How do you all function there? How is your trade with China? Can you give us a sense of understanding, a better understanding of China and what happens inside China?
I mean, to do business in China, you've got to understand China. To do business in India, you've got to understand India. There are Singaporean businessmen who find India very difficult. There are Singaporean businessmen who...
Some Indians also.
Some Indians also. There are Singaporean businessmen who find doing business in China very difficult. So there's no escaping having to understand a country and a market in its own terms. And you can't succeed unless you have the knowledge. So once there are trade and investment flows, I think that knowledge will come. And you begin to know which are the provinces and the cities and their characteristics and the leaders and who are important and who are not, and the character of the workers, the internal competition. And so I think that knowledge will come. If you are Infosys or any of your software companies which have operations in China, I think you understand China because they're making use of Chinese talent working in software, working in Indian companies. If you have Chinese companies doing business in India, you will understand India. What we want is to multiply that by a factor, to include scholars, to include students, to include politicians, so that on every issue, it's easier to work towards win-win outcomes rather than win-lose outcomes. The trade deficit, I think the Chinese are fully aware of. I think Wen addressed that issue directly when he came here. But I believe for trade and investment flows, it's never just a one-way street. It's usually, it requires both sides to cooperate to create a better balance. For us in Singapore, it doesn't matter whether we have a deficit or a surplus. For us, so long as there's movement, there's money to be made. If it's movement out, there's money to be made. If it's movement in, there's money to be made. There's no need for it to be balanced. If we try to be balanced with every of our trading partner, we end up doing much less trade than what we are doing today. I mean, if you are a businessman, you don't care whether you have a surplus or a trade surplus or a trade deficit. All you want is business. So long as there's business, whether you're buying or selling, you make money. I think countries should not be too fixated upon bilateral trade accounts. Your overall trade balance is important because that determines whether you are saving or you're over-saving or over-consuming. But bilaterally, it doesn't matter because when you buy or sell, you're not just the consumer. I mean, we are exporting to others. So we're not, I mean, of course, Singapore is a city-state, so maybe you cannot apply that to a big continental country like India. Not completely, at least. But for us, it doesn't matter whether it's a surplus or deficit, so long as we make money. Yeah.
You've just recently announced, and I'm going to come to the floor in a minute and ask delegates to put questions to you. Yeah. And I see Mr. Menon here who negotiated the CICA with you, sitting here.
Yes.
So he may be given a rose for the trade and investment growth between the two countries, which happened. But my question to you is about Singapore. You've just come out with a new economic strategy for Singapore. You all created a group, I think in the cabinet or partly cabinet, led by Finance Minister Tharman and others. And you keep doing this. What is this? You keep reinventing your country from time to time? And then what is the next kind of 5-10 years priorities for Singapore?
Singapore is a price taker in the world. We have little influence over the environment in which we exist, in which we've got to make a living. So we have to be very alert to changes outside Singapore. And we know that the changes are accelerating. And if we are not very alert to the trends, and if we are not very responsive to these trends, then given our narrow margins, we can easily find ourselves in trouble. The reason why we are preoccupied with reinventing ourselves is because of profound insecurity. That if we are sluggish or complacent, then we'll very quickly find ourselves in danger. So for this reason, we're always talking about, reviewing this, reviewing that, and how we can adjust to a better position. So if we are able to maintain a position, it is because we are working all the time to maintain it. It's not maintained by being static, it's maintained by activity. And being small and being exposed and being so vulnerable, I think forces us to be very alert. And I think what you have said is only half that story. The other half is the insecurity, the sense of insecurity I talked about.
We never feel that. We feel you're very secure. And you have no idea of insecurity in India.
Well, if you're very secure, then you're more likely to be complacent. And if you are big, then you can afford to take more liberties for a longer period of time before you reach limits.
You all have got involved with India all over the country, especially in the south, Singapore business and projects and all that. But least of all in the east. So Sanjeev has a complaint to you. He says, why, I know you're visiting here and you've been to Shantiniketan, but is there a little bit of a higher level of insecurity in Singapore about the eastern region and about Bengal?
I would look at it the other way around. Singapore responds to opportunities. So if Singaporeans are here, there, and the other, it's because here, there, and the other places, the opportunities. If Singapore seems less interested in certain places, then it's because those places are probably less welcoming. And the moment they become more welcoming, you'll find that Singaporeans are quite far up the queue. I think, there's no emotion involved in this. it is just a search for advantage and ease.
You're very practical people. Is that a right way of describing Singaporeans?
I think like most of us in this room.
Mr. Menon, you have a question for the Minister? Mics, please.
So good fond memories of CICA negotiations.
Yes, and I also remember the role at Doha where you nearly got the agreement at Cancun.
Those were less pleasant memories.
When you were head of the agricultural group at Cancun,
that was a nightmare.
Yes. Minister, I just wanted to ask you that how do you see the further development of Singapore has played a very key role in getting India into ASEAN, and every step you have helped the country in the negotiating process and played a very positive role in that. Now we are moving towards strengthening of bilateral relations with Malaysia, with Indonesia, with Thailand, with new agreements there. Do you believe that this kind of networking built around ASEAN is going to strengthen our Look East policy on one side, further the kind of economic strengthening of relationship between ASEAN and India, and what will be its impact on China, ASEAN and India in this kind of situation?
Ever since Narasimha Rao, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao took India on its new policy, all of us remember that first seminar by Finance Minister Manmohan Singh and Commerce Minister Chidambaram in Singapore in October 1991, when they unveiled this new policy. There were many skeptics initially, but over a period of time, it was clear that India was set on an irreversible course. 1994, we talked about the Bangalore IT Park. It was under Moily, I think. Then when David Gowda took over, he flew to Kolkata for that CII meeting in order to reassure Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong that not only would that policy not be changed in Bangalore, that policy would be further developed. And that was shown to be true. And it became clear to us that this policy of reform and opening up had brought bipartisan support. And we on our side took care to ensure that we know we could not change India. India has a momentum and an internal logic of its own. But we were quite sure that this is the direction we'll be moving, and Singapore positioned itself very early to be a partner of India. And we've been proved right. We've been proved right because with that long connection to India going back to the Raj, I think we could feel India in a way which others could not and had to use co-analysis, which meant falling back on historical patterns. We found that our ASEAN partners were slower to see what was happening and to react. But on our side, we've been telling them, our friends in ASEAN, our fellow ASEAN member countries, that look, India will be important, India is growing, and let's prepare for the long-term position. I wish that India has got more diplomats and more trade officials to cultivate each ASEAN country assiduously, the way China does, and China has the whole repertoire of capabilities to do that. But when it comes to India, I find you're very often short-staffed when it comes to the external diplomacy. I worked with Sori Maran, and he told me, look, we are going to lower our tariffs and so on. I must have thrown it on my face. He said, George, you are very skeptical. I will announce it in front of everybody. And he did. And in front of everybody, he said, when I mentioned it to the Singapore trade minister, I was trade minister at the time, he was very skeptical. So I'm in front of him, I'm telling all of you that this is our target. And year by year, he delivered. And now India, I think, has India got a free trade agreement with Japan now?
Just about to sign.
Just about to sign. Even 5 years ago, that would have been inconceivable. But I'm happy to say that that first small free trade agreement with Singapore lit the fuse, and which is leading to comprehensive Indian engagement of Southeast and of East Asia. It will take time. I think you will need to develop more capabilities. You need to increase the external staff and deepen knowledge of individual countries, because each is different. And when you're dealing with China, each province is different, and you need expert knowledge. But these are all what I call good endeavors, because you study, you analyze, and then you get profitable outcomes. These are not efforts which leads to paralysis. These are efforts which lead to benefits, employment, investments, increased trade.
Sir, your name, sir?
I'm Professor Baladars Koshal. I was professor and chair at Jawaharlal Nehru University in Southeast Asian Studies. I happen to be in Calcutta, so I thought I would attend this. Now, Minister, do you think...
Are you Indian?
I'm an Indian, but I look more like a Southeast Asian. In fact, for 40 years I've been working on Southeast Asia, and wherever I go, I mix with the people. I speak also quite a few languages of Southeast Asia.
If I may ask.
Beg your pardon?
Which part of India are you from?
Bengal.
Bengal.
Yeah, Bengal. Now, Minister, do you think that a country which is extremely uncompromising on what is defined so-called core interests, and a country whose entire process of modernization is based on a victim mentality, kind of a what you call suffering humiliation over centuries, and one has to rise to avenge that humiliation. And a country which also feeds on kind of an ultranationalism. Now, this is slightly different from the kind of rise that Japan had at one point of time. Now, when Japan emerged as an economic power, you didn't see that kind of an ultranationalism mixed with a kind of attempt to increase its military power. But here is a situation where you see a country which is, as you know, about the core interests, South China Sea, Tibet, Taiwan, and a whole lot of other issues. Now, here is the country, you see all these core interests, very uncompromising on this issue. And then you see also the kind of ultranationalism which is building within the country. Now, do you think in that kind of a situation, is it possible for a country to contribute to the kind of vision that you had mentioned about India and China trying to sort of, determine the future? They will determine the future in course of time in Asia, because this is no longer the kind of world that we see, what I call a multiple coalitional world, because you build coalition, multiple coalition, because you build coalition on issues. Like India and China will build coalition on certain issues. There will be convergence of interest. There will be also competition. There will be also conflict. So this is a different kind of a world. But the kind of the nationalism that is emerging, do you think it is possible for a country like China to contribute to that kind of a vision that you anticipated or you had mentioned in your inaugural comments?
I don't think that view of China is a fair one. I don't think the view of China you presented is a fair one. China has two core interests, which is articulated formally, Taiwan and Tibet. I think if we were reasonable people in Beijing, that must be the position we take. For the South China Sea, it's quite clear that even if that phrase was used, it was used in an informal, casual manner, and it's not been a position they've repeated. In fact, it's a position which they have indicated to many of us does not apply to the South China Sea. It's important interest, but it is not core interest the way Taiwan and Tibet are core interest to them. In the case of Taiwan, I think there's every reason why it is a matter of the highest importance, because Taiwan was forcibly taken away from them as a result of the Sino-Japanese War of 1894. And under the Treaty of San Francisco, it was to revert back to China and would have been reabsorbed into China, but for the supervention of the Korean War, when the 7th Fleet sailed into the Straits of Taiwan. So for them, it is unfinished business. And you don't need to be a communist to take the position. I think most ethnic Chinese in Singapore will take the position that Taiwan should rightfully return to China one day. So now, has China got a victim mentality? Yes. Sometimes it tends to see issues in terms of others trying to victimize it. But then many countries have that kind of subjective feelings. And what we need is a sense of history. I think China's sense of being a victim is not entirely without reason. If you read the entire history of the 19th century. So you see, well, they do have a reason for feeling that way. Will they contribute to humanity? No, I have no doubts. There are 1.3 billion people. Like India, they produce millions of talented people in every cohort, and they'll contribute in multifarious ways. Will China be nationalistic? I think the Chinese leaders are very careful to be balanced. Young Chinese on the internet can be very nationalistic. But then, as all of us know, on the internet, particularly when they're anonymous, people are unrestrained. And even in Singapore, they are unrestrained when they're anonymous. So I would put a discount on that. The key is whether the next generation will understand what the present generation has had to go through to bring China to where it is today. And what China will become depends not only on itself, on how others interact with it, because it's always a dynamic process. If in their formative years they find that the world treats them unkindly, then they will develop certain instincts. But if they find that good behavior is rewarded by good behavior, then naturally good behavior will prevail. So I would say how India and China manage relations with one another will shape the mentality of a younger generation, and they will inherit that relationship for years to come. So it's very important that even as leaders confer and make agreements and try to solve problems, that there's also an effort made to get young people to visit each other, to make friends, and to try and appreciate each other's point of view. And the media should help play a role in this, but very often the media plays a negative role. I've once suggested, in fact, I've more than once suggested to both the Indian and Chinese side, I say, why not? Because both have enormous railway systems. Why not do a kind of a Euro-rail for each other? Let's say for your top 100 universities, undergraduates can, with a single fee, travel unlimited for 1 month, Indians in China, China in India. And while they're still young, can rough it out and backpacking, let them see each other's country. And that 1 month will shape their thinking for the rest of their lives. And how much would it cost you? I mean, if I were an Indian student, I'll buy that ticket. If I were a Chinese student, I'll buy that ticket. And then you will learn a lot. And I believe that if we can do that, we'll find that actually we learn from one another. And that's what we try to do in the Nalanda project, in this Tagore commemoration, which is to take a longer sweep of things, and how over the years, both sides have learned from each other. In fact, I made one proposal this morning, is why not Joseph Needham did the encyclopedia on science and civilization in China, which continues even after his death. Why not do a Needham-type encyclopedia on Sino-China relations over the centuries in different fields? It could be in Buddhism, it could be in philosophy, in calendars, and the Indians help China correct its calendar. It can be in navigation, where both learn from each other, in fabrics, cotton to China, silk to India. It could be in physics, in mathematics, and there are controversies whether the decimal point originated in India or in China. But there's no doubt that they learn from one another, you know. Because if the monks could travel, and monks could not travel on their own, if monks travel, it means that trade routes already existed. And through those trade routes, ideas would have flowed up and down. And once people do that, they realize, so, hey, we've learned from them and did this. And then they learned from us and did that, and so on. And once people have the attitude that, look, we've benefited from one another, the way they look at one another will change. So I think there's, to me, absolutely no profit in antagonism between China and India. I mean, yes, China has its quirks, but so do Singaporeans, so do Indians. But the more we understand one another, I think the better that future will be.
Sanjay, and then the gentleman next to him.
Mr. Minister, you are absolutely right when you said that Singapore is an extension of India. And I, for one, was reminded about 3 months back, one of my sisters, she used to stay in a coastal town, Tier 2 city, Visakhapatnam, and they were thinking to relocate. So they had the option to go to Kolkata, Delhi, or Bombay, and suddenly I heard that she has gone to Singapore. And she, with her 2 children, they got settled there. So I said, you got admitted in Sanjay West, Kolkata, what happened? How come in Singapore? They said, we came here to visit, and we saw the schools, we saw the environment, pollution-free environment, the quality of life, and we are here. Then I went there last month, and I said, now, how do you feel? And they have 1 car. Fortunately, in their hometown, they have 5. I said, how you manage in 1 car? They say, if we buy a car, it takes us quite a sizable amount to get COE, the Certificate of Entitlement. Until unless that Certificate of Entitlement, which costs anywhere between $50,000, you can't buy the car. So I think these are the things, the governance, Even if you keep a second servant, you have to get a permission and all that. So maybe something our Indian government and you can learn from something. How do we manage the traffic? When we see the traffic here, and how do you manage the traffic in Singapore? That's a wonderful lesson in governance. Connected with that, when we are talking of economic collaboration, I think you also mentioned about the collaboration in education. The wonderful universities like SMU, Singapore Management University, and NUS, National University of Singapore. Why not they have some campus in India? Because now my friend, UK High Commissioner, is sitting here. Earlier, all our children used to mostly go to US and UK, but of late, since last 2 years, we have seen the trend is also going towards Singapore. So there is tremendous opportunity that we could have, tremendous collaboration in the field of education also. And finally, coming close to West Bengal, High Commissioner Singapore is here. You had a visa office here, which unfortunately got closed down about 4 to 5 years back. Maybe the time has again come, as Tarunda said, to reinvent, because you have 2 flights, Singapore Airlines and also Air Asia, going from Kolkata to Singapore. And if you have a visa office here, that might help in accelerating the traffic. It's not only trade, it's also the travel, because I call myself a Bengali. We Bengalis from Kolkata, we are great tourists, and at least we take 4 holidays a year. For Bangkok, you have 4 flights every day of different airlines. So maybe you can also, even with Malaysia, we have opened a new airline now. So Singapore having a visa office here could also expedite things. Thank you.
No, I think once the flows increase, we will need to have a representation in Kolkata. SIA doesn't fly every day. It flies 3 times a week. 3 days a week. But the traffic is growing. And I think it follows the economics. It follows the economics. As for cooperation in education, in municipal services, traffic management, in healthcare, I think all that is already happening. Our urban management companies are everywhere in India now. And there's a high regard, I should say, for Singapore-type urban services. Just a few months ago, the Tamil Nadu government, Stalin came to Singapore, want to do a Singapore River for the Coombe River. We say it won't be easy because it's not just doing technical things. It is social discipline. It is political management. But if we are sought out as a partner and it's beneficial to us, naturally we will try to do our best. We've been working with CII to improve vocational training in India, and there are many other projects. Your highway network is growing very rapidly. Your car population is still relatively low, but it's going to go up like this. And the earlier you put in place traffic management systems, the easier it is. Because once you have many car owners, it's almost impossible politically to change the system. So where you can, in townships and in cities, put in those systems early before people get used to a free-for-all. Yesterday I went to Shantiniketan. There's a good highway, but the road discipline is very bad because I see cars parked alongside bullock carts, people moving up and down. But I had a pilot vehicle and I had flashing lights and sirens. Without that assistance, doing a day trip to Shantiniketan would have been impossible. But even then, it took all of 12 hours, that day trip, and it's quite tiring. So if you do all these things, you will make life much easier, and that would be good for businesses. I see in India increasingly competition among states, among cities, and it is that competitive dynamic rather than a central fiat which will bring about these positive changes. The cities which are able to introduce these things find that they become more attractive habitats for people to live in, for people to work in, for investors to establish factories and management houses, and then they will grow faster. So the fact that you are decentralized, I think it is it will help foster this competitive dynamic. We see the same thing happening in China. The competition within China is intense, between cities, between provinces.
So, and I'll come to you.
Yes. Sorry, just to confuse matters, I'm called Sanjay as well. Sanjay Wadhwani, British Deputy High Commissioner here. Just to go to the last point of Sanjay Budia's thing about a Singapore office, we have some spare space at the British Deputy High Commission. You'd be very welcome to rent that off us if you'd like to open an office.
We outsource to you.
Absolutely. So my question goes back to the point you were making before to, I think, the gentleman from JNU. I think, just to explain my background, apart from having my roots in this wonderful city, in terms of my career in the British Foreign Office, I've spent more than half my 23 years working on China, including stints living there over more than 20 years and running policy. And I see a lot of truth in what you were saying about youngsters, and also what Mr. Das was saying about Track 2. I have many young Chinese friends who I still keep in touch with regularly. I meet many young people here who have travelled to the respective countries between China and India, and I see a lot more positivity amongst the younger generation. I think the professor's view that he expressed is actually, though, quite widely held in India about China. Whether it's right or wrong, it's quite widely held. And I just wonder to what extent you thought that the media also had a role to play in this. And obviously Premier Wen Jiabao, when he was here last week, is reported to have said that the media in India was not playing a particularly positive role in terms of relations. Do you think that's a red herring, or do you think there's some truth in that they don't help in terms of the people-to-people relations?
Well, I'll surely be attacked by the media for saying this. I don't think the media's role is neutral. It can either foster positive feelings or it can accentuate negative feelings. As of now, between China and India, I believe the media's role is on balance more negative than positive. But so too on the Chinese side. At the state level, for the Renminbi Bao and so on, I think they have much more control. But for the less important media outlets, they can be quite neutral too about India. And you get a lot of misunderstandings. I was talking to a Bengali businessman who sat next to me on the flight from Singapore. We were talking about Arunachal Pradesh. He said, well, China occupied so much territory as a result of the 1962 war. I said, no. I said, China invaded, took territory, and withdrew back to a line of control. He looked at me. He said, is that true? I said, yes, that's a fact. He said, oh. But all of us believe that China took territory as a result of the 1962 war. So I thought, if that belief is widespread, then that's part of the problem. But yeah, I think the media can play a more helpful role in this, but without losing objectivity. The key is not to lose your credibility, because once you lose your credibility, then you're useless. Yeah.
Ma'am? It's on.
Okay, I'm Alaknanda Rao, and I run a small training firm, and I would like to express appreciation. About 12, 13 years ago, I was trained under a Singapore cooperation program, which was run by the government of Singapore, and it was a wonderful program, and I would like to give a word of appreciation to you, sir, Minister, sir, today.
Oh,
and
thank you.
Also, I have a very simple question to ask you. You've been just mentioned that we have less opportunities in this part of the world, and East part. I have been observing, you have been traveling here. If we were to ask you to give us one bit of advice on how we could increase our economic growth, just one advice, what would be the top priority that we could look at, say to compete with the growth levels at Southwest China, maybe in other parts of this country and in Singapore. So what, sir, in your opinion, is the area we should prioritize in this part of the country?
You're talking about West Bengal?
About West Bengal, east of India, where the opportunities, as you yourself mentioned, are less than other parts of this country.
No, I think you put yourself in the position of a businessman, of an investor. of a trader. And what you fear most is uncertainty and risk. So if the rules are clear, if agreements are honored, then surely they'll come because they can calculate. And if they calculate that it's profitable, then they're in. And once they're in, then it's their job to make what they promise happen. What they fear most is having agreed the rules change. Then you're in trouble. So I would say, just reduce risk for business people. I mean, business people don't mind policies that they don't like, then they don't invest here. But what they do not want is policies which change midway, then they're in trouble. And if they think that the risks are higher, then the discount rate will be higher, then the whole investment proposition looks less attractive.
Did you want to ask a question? I think you had the mic.
Yeah. Minister, in the proverbial jungle, there is the elephant and then there is the tiger. Both important in a jungle, but there is only one king of the jungle. Would it be fair to say, sir, that the tiger shall always be the king of the jungle and the elephant will trundle along?
Who's the tiger?
Tiger obviously is China.
Oh.
We get described as the elephant from The Economist downwards.
I think both Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and Premier Wen Jiabao, I mean, even at the height of Genghis Khan, there were large parts of the world which he did not dominate. And even the areas in which he dominated, he did not dominate, or his descendants did not dominate for very long.
I think I'm resonating what Dr. Das said in terms of if we get to 100 billion, it will always be that 90-10. I take your greater point. It's the overall, overall there is greater trade. But I mean, do you see, say, 15 years from now that gap closing? I mean,
I think India as a whole has a trade surplus globally.
No.
This is between India and China.
We have a $273 billion deficit this year.
Overall.
Yeah.
$273 billion.
But how much of it is accounted by investment inflows?
Sorry?
How much of this is accounted by investment inflows?
How much it is accounted?
Investment.
Yes.
Coming in.
Oh, not much. Not much.
No.
It's a simple, the trade deficit between, India and the rest of the world. And China this year is going to be something like $24 billion. And the total trade they have estimated latest is the $66 billion.
But it's a macro number you should worry about.
Can I ask a question here? My name is Vivek Kaul. My question is, in the global war on terror, I believe that Singapore could play a very important role because they have some excellent institutions like the Center on ASEAN Governance in the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. Would you see that as realistic? Because the way you have fashioned the boundaries of individual freedoms in your country many decades back seems to have greater relevance today when the world has by and large been rather incompetent in the first decade in the war on terror. So would you see that would be realistic expectation?
Sir, you're referring to the Asian Competitiveness Institute?
No, I am referring, Center on Asian Governance, which is headed by Anne Florini in Singapore.
Oh, that's in the Lee Kuan Yew School.
That's right.
But the question is about Singapore's role in the war on terror.
Because you are a fountainhead of ideas. You may be a very small country, but as you put it yourself, the insecurity which has driven your progress could also be a great resource for the world at large. And I believe that that is a very strong, shall we say, benefit, could be of strong benefit to the whole of mankind.
The problem of terrorism is a complex one.
That's true.
I mean, there are things that you can do in terms of intelligence, in terms of cooperation with other intelligence agencies, of acting proactively, of having laws in place to allow you to detain without having to go to open court. All that you can have, but you must also make sure that within the country itself, conditions for indigenous terrorism are not favorable to terrorism, by which I refer principally to Muslim, non-Muslim relations. And we pay an inordinate amount of attention to fostering good ethnic, inter-ethnic, inter-religious relations within Singapore, fostering trust and ensuring that when problems emerge, we react to them quickly before people get carried away by emotions. And we now have a situation where religious leaders, and there are 10 major religions in Singapore, meet one another regularly, socially, so that they know each other as individuals, not as just leaders of other sects or religions. And from time to time they meet to pray together, to celebrate one another's feast days. That's very important. Problems there always be, but if the leaders have that, enjoy that trust, then these problems can be squelched quickly.
No, I'm talking about it as a reference model because of the way you have laid down the laws in Singapore. It's very clear where the boundaries are. In India, and it's not so clear. More important, in China, I think the values as such don't exist. They're primarily guided by their national interests. For example, you mentioned the growing dominance of China in India. But India would never staple visas on some other country's passport. So it's essentially also a frame of reference. You know, what are the boundaries in which you will...
No, Singapore is a city-state.
Fair enough.
So it is, there's some problems which are much easier for us to solve in Singapore than for a big country like India or China to solve. So we are in no position to advise other countries how they should solve their problems. What we know is you've got to solve problems according to your own specific conditions. And we try to do what we can within our own capabilities. Being small is a great disadvantage, but there are also some advantages. And we try to minimize our disadvantages and maximize our advantages. As to India, I don't really know enough because it's a different political system, it's a different heritage. We have great diversity within the country. Amartya Sen wrote beautifully about the argumentative Indian and what this means in terms of your history, your community relationships. So you've got to find your own solution. I don't think a Western solution can work for you. I don't think a Chinese solution can work for you. And maybe a solution that works in Bengal may not work in Kerala. So we've got to adjust to specific realities. While we welcome people from other countries to study the Singapore experience, we never prescribe to others because we know that foreign prescriptions never work. Others have prescribed to us, we know that in the end we must make our own adjustments for the medicine to work for us. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Sir, I am Professor R.C. Bhattacharya from a local business school. I want to go back to the point of the lady who talked about the West Bengal or the eastern part of India.
Yes.
Now, you have been running your country so well. I mean, here, as you pointed out, you also talked about uncertainty and the changing of the rules of the game. There are two political parties. When one comes, it gives certain rule. The other one changes it. When it comes, that one comes, it's another rule. And that one, other one changes it. What is your advice on that? How do you go about it? What to do about it? And that's the question.
Well, that's what we were afraid of when we established the IT park in Bangalore under Chief Minister Moily. So he promised certain things. Then he lost the election. David Gowda took over. He knew we were afraid. So he was determined to address our concern. So he flew to Kolkata to reassure Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong that nothing would change, that if anything, conditions would be more favorable. And you know, That was critical. He understood our fears. He addressed them explicitly. And because of that, over successive administrations in Karnataka, we've had that trust. And that park has gone into a second phase and is flourishing and profitable. Yeah. So if West Bengal can achieve that, then you will succeed. But if, well, maybe you ask David Gowda for advice.
The foreign minister referred to the rare breed of the Indian diplomatic service. We have scarce resources to take on all the work that we have to do in external diplomacy. You mentioned that China is...
no, you need a much bigger foreign service.
Much bigger foreign service.
Yeah.
So we have here a member of the foreign service, recently retired, Ambassador Tripathi. Can we bring you into the conversation?
No, I entirely agree with Minister George Yeo that if we are going to raise the level of our interaction, whether it be with ASEAN or whether it be with China, we need the requisite manpower, not just in terms of quantity, but also in terms of quality. And that enormous amount of research and background work will have to be done before we can expect to move forward. That having been said, while I entirely share some of the Minister's optimism about the future of China-India relations, certain developments in recent years does give us some pause, make us concerned. I personally was present when Prime Minister Wen Jiabao was in Delhi recently. He spoke very well, but he did not touch upon concerns of real core interest to India in any of his references. And that worries us, because without a shade of doubt, as we move into the 21st century, a lot that is going to happen in Asia and the rest of the world will be defined by Sino-Indian relations. There is no doubt about it. And because we are at this point in time, we are obviously the weaker of the two. Our concerns and worries are understandable. And somehow we feel that China doesn't seem to worry or bother too much about the sensitivities and concerns that we have. And I don't know how the whole situation is perceived, whether it be in Singapore or in ASEAN, whether there is a sense that media or whatever it is, or Indians are hysterical by nature. But the fact of the matter remains that there are really, really serious concerns. And in the course of the discussions that you have been having with us, you must have sensed yourself, Minister, that this is a real worry. So perhaps in your own interactions with the Chinese counterparts, you may be able to convey some of these concerns. And perhaps it would be a good thing if the Chinese showed this level of sensitivity to our worries, and then obviously the two together can make an enormous impact for humanity as a whole.
Singapore has an equity interest in good Sino-Indian relations. An equity interest. If relations between India and China are well managed, Singapore will boom. Yeah. But if relations between China and India turn sour, Singapore will be in a very tricky position. And those divisions will be reflected within Singapore society itself. We know that promoting good relations must be based upon hard-headed reality. It cannot be based on an illusion. So we, as a matter of course, will talk to the Chinese about Indian concerns. I often stress to them that 62 is still a scar in the Indian mind, even though it's forgotten in China. If you're talking about Pakistan, I think that is a different kind of problem, because if you look at it from the Chinese perspective, they've been with Pakistan over such a long time. They can adjust their policies. They can nuance it, but they can't make U-turns, just as they would not with North Korea, just as they would not with any of their they're old friends, because the basis of the statecraft, and this goes back a long time, is to keep long-term records and long-term accounts. This is the basis on which they work. What other areas are there, I mean, of deep concerns to India?
Well, the nuclear issue is certainly one. We are very worried about Chinese proliferation in our neighborhood. You mentioned the staple visa. Suddenly the Chinese media speaks about the border between China and India has been reduced by 1,500 kilometers. 1,500 kilometers of a border with China has disappeared overnight. These are matters of very serious concern.
The visa problem, border problem, what do you mean by, I don't understand this?
We had always assumed that the Sino-Indian border was 3,500 kilometers in length. Now the Chinese official news media refers it to be 2,000 kilometers. And the only conclusion one draws is that the entire border between Jammu and Kashmir and India has disappeared as far as the Chinese are concerned.
I have no compare.
This is a very recent development, so I will not bother. I'm just highlighting. You don't have to comment on this, but I'm just highlighting the kinds of worries and concerns we have. Even while we wish to move forward,
but I thought there is a border committee between Sri Lanka Menon and Taiping Kuo.
This is independent of that.
No, I'm not familiar with this. I think the trade issue, I think that's on the table for sure. Pakistan is in a different category. The border problem will take time to resolve. And it's complicated by the Tibetan problem. What other issues are there?
Well, I mean, these are some of of course, the trade issue has been already referred to, and I substantially agree with you.
Yeah.
Because if we do not put our own house in order, to expect that the Chinese would not be allowed to export to us simply because they have a better manufacturing or better managed economy is not going to happen. So over the years, I hope the Indian economy would grow sufficiently well, be more sophisticated to be able to balance the kind of Sino-Indian trade. That right now there is a worry on that score too. There is also the worry that that China is trying to encircle India through acquiring what they call string of pearls. String of pearls. I mean, bases in Myanmar, in our immediate neighborhood. And that is also a source of worry for a lot of Indians. And so on and so forth. Of course, the Pakistan equation is perhaps the most worrisome of this. That's right. Even on the Security Council.
I think you said enough on China. Would you like to add any more?
No, I'm happy to. I'm listening. Yeah, I'm listening. Yeah, I'm listening. Yeah. Yes, please.
Honorable Minister, this is on a different note. I just happen to know that you are educated at one of the best, the Oxbridge and Ivy League education. So, I recently, few months back, I attended Chris Patton's lecture on the status of the West vis-a-vis Asia, which is one of the topics you raised.
Yes.
He said at the end of the day, in the knowledge economy, it's the quality of the universities and the creativity of the education system which matters, where the West still leads. Of the top 50 universities in the world, 42 happen to be American universities. So, where do you see Asia coming up on that score? Thank you.
Well, I think many good universities will emerge in Asia in the coming years. Yes. We're seeing that now. And even in the top American universities, you find large numbers of Indian and Chinese professors and students. And of course, the most well-known ones are very limited in numbers, and there are more and more applicants. But I believe this will in turn spur the growth of a new tier of top universities in the world. Yeah. Your IITs and IIMs are world-class.
Yes, I am from IIT,
yeah.
But we find that they are basically producing engineers to work in the factories. As per a recent mail I got from the director of IIT Kharagpur, like basically we don't produce intellectual property as the universities of the West. So when do we scale up? That's the question. Like universities in Asia, they produce graduates, they work in the economy, that's all. But we find the Nobel laureates go to most of the Nobel Prizes, and the intellectual property still comes from the West in the world.
No, that's because they've got more developed soft and hard infrastructure. But there's no doubt the NRIs in the West are producing intellectual property. So when conditions back home are favorable, they'll be producing intellectual property back here in India. So it's not the individuals who are the problem. It is the hard and soft infrastructure which is still inadequate. But once they become adequate and protected by agreements and laws and so on, then I believe it will be done here. In Singapore, intellectual property has become a part of our economy. Yeah. So I think it's a matter of time before that comes.
Last question.
Right, thank you. I find that the session is on Southeast Asia, ASEAN and India, while I think for the larger part of this evening we've been talking about China. And I thank you for that, because it is something which is very important to all of us. And especially to us here in India, I think it's a very important subject. My question to you is there any interest in China about India? Have you ever been called upon to talk about India in China? You are very knowledgeable about India, which we have been able to find out in the last 1 hour. So is there any interest there? Or is it just a one-sided interest that think that we are comparable with China? Or is it not?
My first official trip to India was in 1993, and I addressed a gathering in Bombay. It was just after Babri Mosque, and it was not long after The Economist had published a rather bullish article about China. Larry Summers was in the World Bank at the time, and he made some very bold projections. So I talked in that vein. It was not well received in India at that time, because the belief is India is a democracy, India is India, and China may make temporary progress, it cannot last. I found over the years that the view of China has changed. And when India embarked on special economic zones, I was once in Maharashtra and talking to an official responsible for special economic zones. I was so impressed by the thorough knowledge he had of Chinese special economic zones. Sometime in the early 90s, when I was in the foreign ministry as a deputy minister, there was a request by the Indian admin service to send joint secretaries to Singapore for courses. I couldn't believe my eyes that the Indian admin service would deign to send people to Singapore to study from a small country like Singapore. So when that happened, I thought, oh, there's a change in attitude. So I found over the years that from disdain of China's experience, there's more respect, a greater curiosity, and at certain levels, more knowledge. But it is still woefully short. And I would say on both sides. China has specialists who know India very well. You know, Tagore is the most translated in China after Shakespeare. But they've not been happy because they've been translating Tagore through English and Hindi. And they know that in doing that, they lose something. And they've got many Bengali experts. So they are now embarked upon a direct translation from Tagore in Bengali to Tagore in Chinese. They have in many specialized fields, experts who are real experts, far more than you have in India. But I would say, even with all these experts, there is still far from sufficient knowledge, one of the other. And if this relationship is to be founded on win-win, there must be more knowledge. But I must say, over the years, it has been improving. And I believe it will continue to improve in the coming years.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think we need to close now because I asked him for 90 minutes and I think we are over that. And before I invite all of you out for high tea, which my colleagues have organized, young lady there, Ritasri Ghosh and Saha, let me ask Mr. Sanjeev Goenka to wrap up. Say some impolite things about the Minister.
Minister, you are a doer. You have always been very impressive. And this afternoon was no different. Your range, your depth of knowledge, your understanding of China, your vision of India and ASEAN, your balance, your moderation, your key role in Asia. All these come through so clearly. We are very impressed. As always, Singapore is a small but a very key nation. It's a bridge for all of us. Very humbly, but very emphatically, I'd like to say, come back, and come back soon. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in thanking a statesman, a visionary, and a great world leader, Minister George Yeo.